fix the number. Mona Kipling did not look up from her spreadsheet. She had heard the words, processed them, and arrived at her answer before the man who'd said them finished speaking. No. The office went very quiet. It was a small office, one desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet that Mona had reorganized within her first week, because whoever maintained it before her had clearly never heard of an alphabetical system. 3 men in expensive coats had entered without knocking. The one who'd spoken was broad-shouldered and wore the expression of someone who hadn't been told no recently enough to remember what it sounded like. Mr. Halcott needs the Q3 figures adjusted. Mona clicked her pen twice. The Q3 figures are accurate. Mr. Halcott doesn't want accurate. He wants adjusted. She finally looked up. Then Mr. Halcott can find an accountant who makes things up for a living. I don't. None of them moved. In the 8 months Mona had worked as a bookkeeper for Halcott Group's restaurant division, she had survived 3 tax seasons, 1 surprise review from the CRA, and a restaurant manager who tried to expense his dental work as a client lunch. She had not survived all of that to falsify a Q3 report for a man she had never met. "The numbers stay," she said. "If there's an issue with the figures, bring me the source documents and I'll review them. Otherwise, the door is behind you." One of the 3 men stepped forward the way people did when they wanted to make a room feel smaller. The door opened. A 4th man entered. Even before Mona understood who he was, she noticed 2 things. First, he was the kind of handsome that seemed almost confrontational. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, a composed stillness that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without any effort on his part. Second, his presence caused the 3 large men beside her to shrink by approximately 10% without him saying a word. He looked at the spreadsheet on Mona's desk, then at Mona. "Leave it." The 3 men left. The door closed. He was still looking at her. "Soren Halcott," he said, not an introduction, a fact being delivered. Mona had heard the name. Everyone who worked anywhere near the Halcott Group had heard the name. She had simply never connected it to anything in her direct line of work, because her direct line of work was accounts receivable for 4 restaurants in the downtown Toronto core, and Soren Halcott occupied a different altitude entirely. An altitude, she now understood, that included criminal connections. Serious enough to make grown men vanish from conversations when he entered them. Her stomach did something she chose to ignore. "The Q3 figures are accurate," she said again. "I can show you the documentation." Soren studied her. "You weren't afraid of them." "I was afraid," Mona said. "I simply don't falsify records." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite interest, not quite amusement, something more careful than either. He picked up the printed report from the corner of her desk, turned through 3 pages, stopped. "This variance on the King Street location. Walk me through it." Mona hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from recalibrating. He was asking a real question. She answered it. He asked a second one, then a third. For 11 minutes they discussed restaurant cash flow with the precision of 2 people who both, it turned out, disliked imprecision in equal measure. Then Soren set the report down. "Who else has access to these files?" "Me, the restaurant managers for their own locations, your CFO's office." He was quiet for a moment. Then he left without another word. Mona sat with her pen in her hand for a full 30 seconds before she noticed she had not exhaled properly since he walked through the door. What she didn't know was that Soren Halcott would not wait for the Q4 report to cross his desk before finding a reason to come back. The next morning, Mona arrived at 8:47 and found Soren already seated in the narrow hallway outside her office. No entourage. 1 man standing at the stairwell entrance at a distance that was clearly deliberate. Mona stopped. He looked at her over the coffee cup balanced on one knee. I need to review the March through June filings. Those are in the system. Your CFO has access. I want them reviewed here. Mona unlocked her door. You own the building. You don't need an appointment. I'm aware. He stood, but you seem like someone who appreciates notice. She did. She was not going to tell him that. She pulled the relevant files and walked him through 6 months of restaurant income, flagging 2 anomalies she had already noted and submitted to the CFO's office. Soren listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of which revealed that he understood the numbers better than most people who came asking about them. At the end, he set down his coffee. Billable hours. Mona looked up. Sorry. Your time, is this billable? She hadn't thought about it. In her experience, nobody who owned the company asked to be charged for taking up an accountant's morning. I'll figure out a rate, she said. Something almost resembling a smile moved across his face without fully arriving. Send it to my office. The invoice was paid within the hour. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The following week, Soren came in with a question about the depreciation schedule for the Bloor Street kitchen renovation. Mona answered it and billed him 45 minutes. The week after, he wanted to discuss supplier payment timelines. She billed him an hour. The week after that, he arrived with a folder containing absolutely nothing that couldn't have been resolved with a 2-line email. Mona looked at the folder, then at Soren. This is not a complex question. I wanted context. The context is 3 lines in the Q2 summary I already sent you. He looked at her steadily. I prefer it explained in person. She explained it. She billed him 30 minutes. He paid. Every time without argument, which she found both professionally satisfying and mildly suspicious. By the 4th visit, even the man stationed in the stairwell had started bringing a paperback. Mona opened a separate ledger for Halcott consultations. It was, she acknowledged to herself quietly, the most reliable revenue stream she had managed in years. But in the 5th week, something changed. Mona had been working through year-end projections late on a Thursday when she found it. Not in the restaurant accounts, but in the consolidated subsidiary reports that her access technically covered, and that nobody had thought to ask her to review. A pattern. Small withdrawals, irregular intervals, rotating vendor accounts. 17 months of it, accumulating to a number that made her sit back in her chair and stare at the drop ceiling for a long moment. Someone had been skimming from the Halcott group for a year and a half, carefully, methodically, in a manner that suggested whoever was doing it understood precisely how the previous bookkeepers organized their files, and had been counting on no one looking at the full picture. Mona printed 4 pages of documentation and sat with her hands flat on her desk. She was a bookkeeper for a restaurant group with organized crime connections. The most powerful man in that organization had visited her office 4 times in 5 weeks on increasingly transparent pretexts. And now she was holding evidence that someone inside his operation had been stealing from him with a patience and sophistication the team had apparently missed or quietly ignored. She made a second coffee, read through the documentation again. Thought about every previous accountant in this office who had presumably also had access to these files and had chosen to see nothing. Then she called Soren's office number and asked for 30 minutes. He arrived in 20. She showed him the 4 pages without preamble. He read through them twice. The stillness that fell over him was different from his usual composure. Denser, colder, the quality of still water before something surfaces through it. How long have you had this? Since last night. And you called me. It's your money. She paused. And whoever is doing this is careful enough that I couldn't tell whether reporting it through normal channels would reach the right people or the wrong ones. Soren looked at her for a long moment. That was a careful calculation. I do careful calculations for a living. He took the pages. At the door, he stopped. You could have ignored this. It wasn't in your assigned scope. It was in my access, Mona said. Technically, that makes it scope. 3 days later, one of the CFO's senior associates quietly ceased appearing in the building. Nobody explained why. Nobody asked Mona about it either. She submitted her invoice for the Thursday consultation. He paid it before she got home. By the 7th week, Mona had begun noticing things she did not particularly want to notice. Soren Halcott, a man who managed criminal operations across 3 provinces and legitimate businesses worth more than Mona had processed in her entire career combined, had developed a habit of paying attention to small things. When the ancient photocopier in her hallway jammed 3 days in a row, it was replaced without her filing a maintenance request. When she mentioned once, briefly, that she'd been eating at her desk because the staff room was being renovated, sandwiches from the restaurant on the ground floor began appearing outside her door at noon, wrapped properly, with a napkin. She didn't mention it. He didn't mention it. But one Tuesday afternoon, she looked up from a projection report to find him in the visitor's chair, reading through a filing she hadn't given him, and she realized the sandwiches had started the same week he'd come in about the depreciation schedule. He looked up. The harborfront location is underperforming. I flagged that in September. I know. I'm rereading it. A pause. You ordered the chicken sandwich. Mona set down her pen. Excuse me. Yesterday, you left the arugula. She stared at him. You are telling me you know what I pick off my lunch. The kitchen knows. I happened to ask. He returned to the file. They'll leave it off tomorrow. Mona decided this was something she would examine later, when she had more available processing capacity. Liam Pratt started as a junior analyst in the 8th week. He was 28, excellent at Excel, and had apparently decided the best way to learn the Halcott restaurant accounts was to spend time in Mona's office asking questions. They were good questions. She appreciated that. Soren arrived on a Thursday to find Liam leaning against the filing cabinet, while Mona walked him through a supplier reconciliation. Something about the room seemed to adjust when the door opened, not the temperature, more like barometric pressure. Liam noticed Soren immediately and introduced himself with the competent politeness of someone who understood rooms and made a sensible exit within 90 seconds. Soren looked at the chair Liam had just vacated. He's a junior analyst, Mona said. I know who he is. He's learning the accounts. I'm aware. Soren placed a folder on her desk, the Danforth projections. Mona opened the folder. The Danforth projections were not complex. She had sent a summary to the CFO's office 4 days ago. She looked at the folder, then at Soren. These are in the system. I wanted them reviewed in person. She held the folder for 3 full seconds. How much do you actually know about the Danforth projections? Enough. Because I'm beginning to think you know enough about most of these reports to not require me to walk you through them. Soren's expression remained unchanged, as it nearly always did, but something behind it shifted slightly. Perhaps I value the review process. Mona reached for her billing ledger. 45 minutes. Fine. Liam is also thorough with review processes. The briefest pause she had ever observed from him. I'm certain he is. She wrote up the invoice, and felt something that might have been, if she were being entirely honest with herself, a small and inconvenient flicker of warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system. The Halcott Group's annual dinner was held at the King Street property in November. Mona attended because her name was on the invitation, which she found surprising, and because the financial summary presented to investors included 3 years of restaurant performance data She had rebuilt from near-incoherent records. Her name was not on the summary. She had not expected it to be. For the first hour, she stood near the edge of the room and answered questions from the few people who had thought to look at the actual numbers rather than just the graphs. She found that satisfying. She did not particularly want to be visible at an event like this. The room was full of people who wore their money loudly, and Mona had spent most of her adult life learning to make herself small in rooms where she didn't quite feel like she belonged. Then Genevieve Aldrich found her. Genevieve was Halcott Group's Director of Investor Relations. She was polished in the way that requires significant maintenance, and she introduced Mona to a cluster of investors with the words, "This is Soren's little numbers girl. She keeps the restaurant side of things tidy." Mona smiled. "Mona Kipling, I'm the divisional bookkeeper." "Of course." Genevieve's smile held perfectly. "She's very good with the day-to-day. Soren relies on her for the smaller accounts." The investor asked a question about year-over-year revenue growth. Mona answered it accurately. Genevieve redirected the conversation toward the expansion plans. 10 minutes later, at a second table, "You'll want to speak with Soren's numbers girl. She handles the operational side, very detail-oriented." Mona excused herself before a third introduction could happen. She stood near the bar and understood with complete clarity what was being done. Nothing incorrect, everything deniable. Just 2 words carefully positioned every time. Soren's and Little, collapsing 3 years of painstaking reconstruction into a charming errand she performed for an important man. She was deciding how directly to address it when Genevieve lifted her champagne glass across the room and announced to a group of investors that discussions were underway to bring Mona's division under a centralized finance arm. Better resources, broader scope, real development opportunities. The room shifted. People looked over. Someone touched Mona's arm. "How exciting! You must be so pleased. He clearly sees the potential." Another voice. "You're in good hands with Soren. He looks after the people he values." Mona looked across the room. Soren was already watching. His expression had the quality of controlled winter, very still, very cold. But Mona spoke first. "Did you authorize that?" She was looking directly at him across the room. The particular silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone realizes, simultaneously, that power is not standing where they assumed it was. "No," his voice carried without effort. "I didn't." Mona turned to Genevieve. "My name is Mona Kipling." Genevieve's composure was excellent. "Of course." The financial reconstruction in the summary tonight covers 37 months of restaurant operations across 6 locations. I rebuilt it from incomplete records over 4 months. That work is mine. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "My name should be on it." Nobody moved. "And my division is not available for reorganization without a conversation with me first. Not consultation." She paused. "With me first." Soren stepped forward, not in front of her, beside her. "There are no authorized discussions regarding changes to any accounting structure within this group." His voice was quiet in the way that rooms leaned toward. "Any proposal affecting Ms. Kipling's work requires her direct participation, beginning with her." He glanced at Genevieve once, briefly. That was the entirety of what Genevieve needed. An investor recovered and asked Soren a question about the spring expansion, successfully rescuing the atmosphere. Soren answered it, but before he turned away, he looked at Mona. A brief, specific look. Not claiming, checking. She gave him nothing visible, but she didn't step away either. Later, at a window overlooking King Street, Mona watched the room continue without her and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief. Soren appeared at a careful distance. Genevieve acted without direction from me. "I know. Your name should have been on the summary from the start. I should have caught that." She looked at him. It was an oversight. It was careless. I'm not careless about things that matter. A pause. I want that to be clear. Mona turned back to the glass. The streetcars below were lit amber in the cold. Everything outside was ordinary and indifferent. You did the right things tonight, she said finally. You said the right things. You stood in the right place. She was quiet for a moment. But outside this building, your name changes everything it touches. The summary becomes yours. The numbers become yours. I become something that exists in relation to you. She looked at her own reflection in the window. I've spent 8 months building something that stands on its own. I don't want it to start being described as something you allowed. Soren was quiet. What do you need? He said. Not a solution, not a counter-argument, just the question. Time, she said, and some distance for a while. He nodded once. All right. And he gave it to her without asking what he was owed in return. The following week, Soren did not come by the office. No files she hadn't requested appeared on her desk. The hallway chair outside her door remained empty at 8:30 in the morning. The week after, Mona caught herself listening for footsteps at 10:30, which was approximately when he usually appeared when he was going to appear. She noted this and ignored it professionally. By the 3rd week, she had reorganized the filing cabinet twice. She was aware that this had nothing to do with the filing cabinet. The office was correct. Quiet, orderly, the sandwiches had stopped coming, which made complete sense, and which she resented in a way that was difficult to account for in any ledger. Liam stopped by on a Wednesday to go over the harbourfront projections, and at the end he mentioned a new place on Queen West if she ever wanted to grab dinner and talk through Q1 strategy in a less formal setting. It was a reasonable invitation from a reasonable person. There would be nothing complicated about it. Mona thought about a man who had learned what she removed from her lunch and quietly had it corrected without making it a gesture. I'll think about it, she told Liam. Thank you. He smiled and left the report on her desk. That evening, after the building emptied, Mona sat in her office, looking at the neat rows of numbers she had spent a year making reliable and true. She thought about the fact that the most organized, accurate, honestly documented part of her professional life existed in a building owned by someone who had never once, in 8 months of increasingly transparent excuses, suggested that she change a single thing about herself or her work. She thought about a man who had arrived in a hallway before business hours, because she seemed like someone who appreciated notice. She picked up her phone and sent a message to his office line. Q1 preliminary is ready if you want to review it in person. 3 minutes later, when? She considered. Tomorrow, 8:45. I'll be there at 8:30. Mona put her phone in her bag and went home. For the first time in 3 weeks, she slept without waking at 2 in the morning, convinced she had misfiled something. At 8:31 the next morning, Soren Halcourt was already in the hallway chair with a coffee that bore the logo of a specialty roaster on the east side of the city, the kind of place with a lineup out the door on weekend mornings that extended past the neighboring dry cleaner. Mona stopped, looked at the cup. Where is that from? Dundas East. She took it before she decided whether that was wise. It was genuinely exceptional. She looked at him over the rim. That's a 20-minute drive from here. I was up early. You drove 20 minutes for a coffee. I drove 20 minutes, he said, with a precision she recognized as deliberate, and the coffee was available. She sat down. They worked through the Q1 file in the usual way, she explained. He asked real questions. Numbers were treated as the honest things they were. At the end, Soren set down his cup. The report is in excellent shape. Yes. You didn't actually need me to review it. Mona looked at the screen, then at him. No. He was quiet for longer than his usual quiet, which was already longer than most people's. "I owe you something closer to the truth," he said, "about the early visits." She waited. "The first time I came back," Soren said, "it was because you found something no one else in my organization had the professional honesty to report. Every accountant before you had access to those files. None of them brought me what you brought me." A pause. "The second time I told myself it was about the accounts." Mona held very still. By the third time, it was not the accounts. She said nothing. Somewhere down the hall, the kettle in the staff room clicked off. Outside, a streetcar ground past on King. "I kept finding reasons," he said. "The depreciation schedule. The Danforth folder that we both understood was not a complicated situation." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted to be here, in this office, where the numbers are what they actually are, and someone tells me so regardless of what I'd prefer to hear." Mona breathed in carefully. "Everyone tells you things. Everyone manages what they tell me." There was no complaint in his voice, just the fact of it. "You give me the actual figure, whether it's favorable or not, whether it reflects well on how I've been running things or poorly." A pause. "I haven't had that in some time." She understood this more than she wanted to. She had rebuilt accounts for 8 months that told the truth about restaurants losing money, and the record before her arrival had been smoothed, rounded, optimistically adjusted by people who were afraid of what accurate numbers might cost them. "Why didn't you just ask me to dinner?" Mona said, instead of the Danforth projections. Soren Halcott, who managed an organization across 3 provinces and negotiated with people who had never learned to refuse him, did not answer immediately. Then he said, "Because it was the one question I couldn't know the answer to in advance. And I found that I didn't want to ask until I was willing to accept whatever you said." There it was. No leverage, no angle, just the honest number offered plainly. Mona looked at the Q1 report on her screen, genuinely in excellent shape, genuinely not requiring an in-person review. "You drove 20 minutes for the coffee," she said. "Yes. And it's very good." "I know." She looked at him. "Dinner." He was careful in the way he was always careful. "Is that a yes?" "Yes." She reached for her billing ledger. "Consultation fee still applies." He looked at the Q1 report they both understood had not needed consulting, for a report that required no intervention. "You made me pull it up twice." The corner of his mouth moved. Barely, but she had learned to read the small increments. "How much?" Mona wrote the number and turned the ledger to face him. He paid it without reading it first, which she found, in a way she hadn't anticipated, completely charming. 6 months later, the bookkeeping office at Halcott Group's restaurant division looked almost exactly the same. That mattered to Mona. Nobody had offered her a larger office, which she would have declined. Nobody had quietly arranged a renovation, or suggested rebranding the division, or made any of the dozen gestures of well-financed interference that she had been half expecting. What had changed was that the quarterly reports now listed the divisional analyst by name. The investor summary from the spring gala credited the financial reconstruction to Mona Kipling, bookkeeper and restoration specialist. And 3 heritage restaurant groups in the city had reached out to inquire whether her firm. She had registered it formally in January. Kipling Financial Consulting, no consultation required, took on contract work. Soren had learned about the registration the day after she filed it. He had looked at the name on the certificate and said it once quietly to himself. Then he asked when her first client meeting was. They were taking things slowly. For a man who had compressed most of his decisions into the time it took most people to form an opinion, Soren Halcott had become, in specific and deliberate ways, very good at the word slowly. On a Thursday in April, he arrived 11 minutes before closing and found Liam Pratt leaving with a client binder under one arm and a coffee from the Queen West place Mona liked in his other hand. Liam said good evening to Soren with the uncomplicated ease of someone who had arrived at a personal accommodation with reality. Soren returned it with the controlled civility of a man who was working toward the same. Liam left. Soren looked at the coffee cup on Mona's desk, his roaster's cup, not the Queen West one. "Don't," Mona said without looking up. "I haven't said anything. You were about to." A pause. "He knows your order." "So do you." "I drove 20 minutes. And I drank every drop of it." She looked up. "And I will drink this one because there are invoices left, and I have been sitting in this chair since 8 this morning." Soren sat down in the visitor's chair. He had long since stopped framing these visits as consultations. They both understood what they were. "You can stay," Mona said, "if you're going to sit there anyway." He stayed. He did not fill the silence unnecessarily. He did not check his phone every 3 minutes the way most people in the grip of a busy life did. He simply sat, and the office did not feel smaller for it. It felt in a way she had not anticipated and would not have designed for herself, like a room where someone was expected to be. When she finished, she pushed back from her desk and found him watching her, with the particular stillness she had stopped finding alarming sometime around week 6. "Dinner?" she said. He stood. "Where?" "Anywhere. You're not going to order for me." "I've never ordered for you." "Good. Let's keep that record clean." He held the door. She gathered her coat, the good one, wool, that she had stopped saving for special occasions sometime in February, and walked out of her perfectly organized office into an evening that was cold and lit and entirely her own. He fell into step beside her. Not ahead. Not a half step behind in the way that was its own kind of statement. Beside her, at the same pace, taking up the same amount of pavement. Mona had decided some time ago that this was the only arrangement she was ever going to accept. It turned out to be the only one he had ever wanted to offer.